Welcome to In a Post-Platform Media World, Destinations Matter Most. Please welcome to the stage Publisher and Editor-in-Chief of The Green Line, Anita Lee.
Hey, y'all. So welcome to In a Post-Platform Media World, Destinations Matter Most. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Anita Lee. I'm the publisher and CEO of The Green Line, which is a hyper-local independent news outlet based in Toronto. I'm also an ONA board member. So before we begin, I want to remind everyone to vote in the board elections. Candidates' profiles are on journalist.org. You can also click on the link in the website or the conference app to vote. Okay, so let's get started. I'm thrilled to introduce Hillary Frey, Slate's editor-in-chief. Previously, she was executive editor of HuffPost, editorial director of news at NBC News, the media and culture editor at the New York Observer, and way back in the past, an editor at The Nation and Lingua Franca magazines, with a few other gigs in between. Hillary was also on a Peabody-winning team at NBC for their project In Plain Sight, which focused on downward mobility in America. Her team also won 2 Emmys, including one for NBC's coverage of the Boston bombing. In addition, she's a graduate of the executive program in news innovation at the City University of New York, and she lives in Brooklyn with her daughter. Today, Hillary is speaking to the issue of how, in the wake of Facebook and X reducing their ties in journalism, news sites can once become a destination. We'll have a 15-minute Q&A period for audience questions, so be sure to submit your questions through the link in the session description on the conference website or on the app. So now, without further ado, please welcome Hillary Frey.
Wow, that's like cool music to come up here too. Thank you, Anita, for that introduction, and thank you so much to ONA and the team for asking me to speak today. People, and I know some folks here, nice to see friendly faces always out in the audience, but people who know me will tell you I really like to talk. I'm not shy about sharing my opinions, and actually, in kindergarten, I got in trouble for raising my hand too often and wanting to answer questions and asking questions, and my daughter does the same, which is, I guess it's hereditary. But speaking in public is not something I do very often. So it's a very special opportunity for me today to be here and really sharing publicly some, I would say, recollections and thoughts I have from my career in media and this moment that we're in this sort of post-platform world. It's a big title for this talk, but I want to tell you what to expect is something a little more narrative, maybe a little bit gossipy, and definitely very personal to my experience, but I hope that it resonates with folks who are here today. So I'm not here to share a skill, per se, but I hope sharing some stories about my past lives and my current one might provide some learnings and give you some things to think about. And I'm not here to look way into the future. Aside from being an editor for the last 25 years, I'm also a longtime yoga practitioner, and I'm really working constantly on staying in the present moment and focus on what's happening right now, not 6 months from now or a year from now, even though a lot of what's happening right now informs that time, but that's what I'm really focused on. I'm here today to look at the recent past in digital media and bring us to the moment we're in and talk a little bit about why I think this is actually a more stable time in our business than the last decade, when startups flourished, salaries ballooned, and dreams of cross-platform talent drove many of us to search for unicorns that rarely exist. It was a wild ride. So let me explain how I got here today. What happened is I wrote a piece for Slate. Most of you are probably familiar with Slate, but I wanted to share a little bit about how I think about my part of it, which is running the website. Lots of you will know Slow Burn and our daily podcast, What Next, and all kinds of other amazing audio we do. That's separate from the world I'm talking about today. On the site, we published an extremely voicey mix of news and news analysis, top-notch reporting on the Supreme Court, incisive politics analysis, essential culture coverage, quirky and relatable essays and reporting on how we live, thoughtful deconstruction of things happening in tech, business, cities, infrastructure, and all the things that affect us in our lives. And of course, we have advice. Most notably, Dear Prudence, the longtime anchor of Slate's advice universe, which includes other columns focused on money, parenting, and sex. I started this role as editor-in-chief of Slate in June 22 with an advantage. Slate had been around since 1996 and was the first digital magazine to exist. Back then, you found everything through the homepage on Slate and elsewhere. And Slate.com is still crucial to showing who we are and telling that story, maintaining our voice, and showcasing our longtime features like Prudy and promoting new ones like Human Guinea Pig, which is exactly what it sounds like. Go check it out. And Medical Explainer, which was really important during COVID, or the heights of COVID. We're not out of it yet, obviously. War Stories, our foreign policy column written by Fred Kaplan, is nearly as old as Slate itself. We're still a destination, and we put thought and creativity into our homepage and recirculation on our article pages, so when people find us, even through search, they get a strong sense of where they've landed. Slate is quirky, which makes our mix reliably interesting, but also constantly surprising. Our editors are generating ideas based on their own experiences and observations. But of course, we're also very on the news. And on the morning of April 20th of this year, there was big news in our business. BuzzFeed News was dead. So finally, I'm going to tell you why I'm standing here in front of you. Our daily news meeting then was at 11:30, now it's at noon, and BuzzFeed News was the talk of it at that time, that morning. The tweets, or whatever we're calling them now, were coming in very fast, many blaming BuzzFeed founder Jonah Peretti for not investing properly in news, for screwing up with the SPAC effort, all that acquisition, for buying Complex and HuffPost instead of focusing on his own core brands. And of course, the end of BuzzFeed News would mean layoffs, which are always terrible for people and for the industry. But I thought something was missing from the conversation. And as I began to articulate it to my colleagues in this news meeting, Slate's executive editor, Susan Matthews, said to me, "Please get off the call and go write that. I'll edit it. Goodbye." I'd say about a quarter of our assignments happen that way. From Zoom conversations or IRL or chats on Slack, "just go write it" is a pretty regular refrain at Slate. This was a moment where my age and my experience was an advantage to the news story. But saying what I wanted to say required going back in time. So basically, I'm going to take you on that journey with me today. And if it wasn't obvious already, that day I published this piece about BuzzFeed News. Industry folks talked about it, and the wonderful people at O&A reached out to me about bringing some of those ideas. So here I am. As Anita mentioned, before Slate, I had been executive editor at HuffPost, which was acquired by BuzzFeed in 2021. Acquisitions are a brutal experience. They always mean cuts. I mean, wouldn't you too look for efficiencies if you were buying a business that shared so much overlap with the one you were already running? I understand it. But I ultimately left HuffPost along with other members of the newsroom whose roles had been eliminated in that acquisition process. So I had some exposure to BuzzFeed and to Jonah before I left. And while you might think the whole thing left me a little sour, and I am on some points, but I won't dwell on those, my ill feelings weren't directed at Jonah in this process. And this is what I argued for in my piece in Slate. There were other villains to blame for the end of BuzzFeed News and other sites that have come and gone for similar reasons. Jonah wasn't blameless, but we shouldn't forget the audacity he had in the first place that ultimately made digital news more interesting and dynamic than it would have been otherwise. He and Ben Smith would build a newsroom, ultimately a global one, using the lessons they learned from virality at BuzzFeed.com. The goal was to make the world, and especially young people, more informed, more entertained, more connected. And along the way, he trained and nurtured dozens of journalists, some of whom work with me at Slate today. So who did I blame? I'm talking about social media, third-party platforms, venture capital investments, and the endless pursuit of scale. In fact, the occasion of BuzzFeed News' downfall reminded me of the various troubled enterprises I'd been part of over the last 25 years, and how much of a relief it is to now be at Slate, which has managed not only to survive the boom and bust of the 2010s, but grow its core brand in a way that may not make it bulletproof, but certainly makes it a much steadier ship than I've had the privilege of steering for a long time. I hope talking about this might be cathartic for some of you, or at least an opportunity for us to bond over some of these moments. The earliest days of my career were in print magazines at The Nation and Lingua Franca, both great magazines, and later at Salon.com and the New York Observer, and then later Adweek, where I worked for Michael Wolff. They aren't so relevant. Social media hadn't really arrived in our industry. It wasn't disrupting anything. Friendster was kicking around. And actually, my friend Richard is here, and we were definitely friends on Friendster in 2001. Facebook was still where you were posting vacation photos and writing quirky status updates, and Twitter was for inside jokes. But in 2011, I went from Adweek to Yahoo News to run coverage of the 2012 presidential election, and by then everything was very different. Yahoo News was my first encounter with big tech, which was only starting to creep into our lives in this business. There was so much money. I had reporters on campaign planes. I had huge teams at both party conventions. I took my 6-month-old baby to Tampa for the Republican National Convention. We were charged with doing original content, meaning not blogging, not aggregation, and for what was at the time touted as the biggest news site in the world. When I was there, we had posters all over the office touting that we had 86 million unique visitors a month. 86 million. That was Yahoo. The strategy was built on a dominant idea at the time that original content, meaning work created and owned by Yahoo rather than aggregated or blogged, would be more valuable and could be sold at a premium to advertisers. With Yahoo's massive scale, we theoretically had the potential to make a lot of money for the company. But even as I was the editor-in-chief, I didn't really see the point from the audience's perspective. Yahoo was a destination where people were checking their mail, and they encountered news while they were there, and they read a lot of things. And they read a lot of things because Yahoo ingested and published just about every newspaper, website, and magazine out there. And it was the breaking news and sports and real left field stuff that got the clicks, not my original politics team. But in addition to betting on original content bringing in revenue, there was a desire on the part of corporate executives for more access to power of any kind, actors, politicians, influencers. They wanted Yahoo News to be thought of as a news brand, and this was a way to help make that happen. And my team was seen as a way into that. The most ridiculous thing I was tasked with doing in pursuit of luring the desired famous people to Yahoo was spend months planning and launching a Twitter-native hashtag-based game. Let's break that down. Twitter-native news game that was based on a hashtag at the behest of my boss and our marketing team. The idea was to pose a daily question on Twitter and have a panel that we'd recruited of famous folks with big followings answer the question, also on Twitter. As if this would somehow up Yahoo News' brand recognition and get us respect from a certain class of people, and but more important, to find a way to officially partner with Twitter. So the idea was we're going to come up with this Twitter native thing off platform so that Twitter gets excited about it and likes us and thinks we're cool. This is the first time I recall being asked to dictate editorial strategy and direct resources to a project less intended to serve or grow our audience than to get in with a platform, but it certainly was not the last. Unsurprisingly, our audience didn't really care about this off-platform work. In fact, I'm not sure anybody did. I don't know if anybody here remembers hash out the game. It was a great, Katie's laughing, she doesn't remember it. I still have the mug though. We did an event around it at South by that year in 2012. But all this is to say is that when NBC News sent me an email about coming to NBC, I took the call and then I went to NBC News. I loved being at NBC. We're not going to talk a lot about NBC because social was not a big part of what was going on for me there. And as Anita noted, it was such a privilege to have tons of reporting resources and great people and win awards, because awards are great. At that time, digital really lived in a constant shadow to broadcast. And even when we broke news on the website, coming from inside the network or from our own journalists, we couldn't really get the respect or the traction that we were hoping for, and it felt like a real culture clash. And in 2014, when I was there was another strategy shift, there were some departures, my team had layoffs, and I decided to move on again. So when I used to interview for jobs, people would call me and then they would immediately ask me, why do you change jobs every 18 months? And I would say, well, you called me, so you can think about that. But all this time, I was watching places like BuzzFeed News, Vice, Mike, Refinery 29, Vocative. I'm sure we could list a half dozen more. Grow and grow and grow. Press releases announcing massive investments and page views came frequently. Scale was everything. Venture capital money was flowing on the promise of eternal growth on the backs of both the internet and, of course, at this point, Facebook. SEO took a back seat, and social packaging was everything. A few of these digital native places, as they were called me about jobs. There was an advantage to being one of the few women working in managerial roles in newsrooms at that time, I have to say. I hope there are a lot more now, and I think thanks to ONA and other places there are, but there weren't a lot of us, and this was not that long ago. So I would say I'm complaining a lot in this talk, but it wasn't all bad. In the mid-2010s, there were opportunities springing up everywhere. The world of journalism got more diverse. When I decided I wanted to move on, I would put a few thoughts and emails out into the universe and see what came back. And when I wanted to leave NBC, what came back to me was Fusion. Fusion, which you may or may not know, but I'll tell you more about it if somehow you missed the Fusion wave of this era. Fusion was a new venture. It had a lot of heat on it. It had money. It had so much money. It had a cool mission to serve multicultural millennials. It had freedom from what Jay Rosen calls the view from nowhere. There were a few big names already at Fusion, and it had all the potential to be a success on social media with younger users and readers. In fact, the entire plan to build Fusion's audience was created on a strategy of distributed content. We put minimal thought into our homepage and focused instead on crafting creative curiosity gap headlines that mimic those of Upworthy as much as possible. We also, I hope you remember Upworthy. You remember Upworthy. We also counted on amplification by the social accounts of ABC News and Good Morning America, which were our sister publications in the Fusion joint venture, which was actually a product of ABC News and Telemundo. So they had invested in creating this new product, Fusion, for this market of young people of diverse backgrounds. I mean, what a cool opportunity coming from straight news. At first, we toyed with our voice and did the best we could to create clicky headlines that would stand out in people's feeds, while covering news stories that we deemed relevant to our audience, like the massacre at the Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina. I still remember the night that news broke. Hello, ladies, friends. The night the news broke, and we were, I believe, the first to call it a hate crime, which it was. We wanted to do journalism that called things as our reporters saw them without flinching and move away from the basic conservatism of mainstream media. However, I increasingly found my job as a newsroom leader managing a line between journalists who, for good reason, recoiled at promoting their stories on social media with sensational or overly clever headlines that were often a mismatch in tone with the actual work. Our partnership with ABC and GMA fell apart quickly. Those established brands did not want to suddenly be pumping Black Lives Matter and anti-extremism content into their straight news or lifestyle feeds. We couldn't hack a growth formula, but we kept trying. And each time, the core mission of Fusion, to cover news that would matter to this group of young people, was diluted in the pursuit of scale. That's diluted, not diluted, diluted in the endless pursuit of scale. The nadir of this time may have been, but I can't say for sure because there were a couple low points, when I was tasked with other leaders to create a list of celebrities with big followings on Facebook and Twitter who we could either entice to write for the site, the idea being that if, say, in 2015, Lena Dunham or Lin-Manuel Miranda wrote for Fusion and tweeted or posted their piece to Facebook, their millions of followers would immediately convert to readers and lovers and sharers of Fusion's content. I would call this endeavor a misguided waste of time that wouldn't have worked even if it had worked. So none of these people ever wrote for Fusion, of course, right? Why would they? They could write for the New York Times or the New Yorker. You can't build a destination, which we needed to become in order to get that reach and scale we needed to survive, on the backs of other people's social feeds or an individual's often fleeting celebrity. I knew this, but I went through the motions with this project anyway to keep my job. There were some tough lessons I learned from Fusion that today are painfully obvious, but in 2016 were pretty spicy. So I will tell you what they are. The first is that you can't build a loyal audience on distributed platforms. It doesn't matter if your video got 50 million views, and I'll talk a little bit more about these numbers, kinds of numbers, in a minute. Those 50 million views don't mean 50 million people came to your website or love your work. It means they saw 3 seconds of something you made in their feed. High-profile hires will not guarantee an audience for your brand. You can throw money at big names, but if you do not already have a brand and an audience that makes sense for them, it's incredibly difficult to build business on star power alone. And I'm not talking about newsletter collectives and Substacks and the things that we're seeing evolve today and these small subscriber-based products that are successful. I'm talking about building a big site with a big audience almost exclusively off of individual personalities. And most important, strategies based on the desires of third parties, whether Facebook, Snapchat, Instagram, Twitter, or whatever, is a losing proposition. That might sound obvious today, but 7 years ago it wasn't at all. And perhaps the silliest example of this that I ever saw was when Snapchat was launching Discover on the US app. And it was when publishers could have their own little channels in this niche part. I think it still exists. I'm not a Snapchat user, but inside the app. And at this moment in late 2015, it was like very exciting to be part of it. And the executives at Fusion really wanted to be in there because it was very cool. Snapchat offered us some kind of trial to see how our stuff would perform. So it was determined that our editor-in-chief, I was running the politics team, our editor-in-chief, not me, but Alexis Madrigal, who I'm sure many of you know as a brilliant writer and creator, he was basically sequestered with a little task force to focus on creating a Snapchat Discover channel for a few months. So let me put this another way. In the run-up to the 2016 election, 2016, remember? Trump, Clinton, right? Top resources from across the company at Fusion, including the leader of the news website that was focused on covering politics and social justice, were pulled off any daily responsibilities to try and get in good graces with a tech platform that, in my experience, seemed to have little interest in actually promoting us. Fusion was so tiny. We were not competitive in that space. We threw money at celebrities to make some content for us on that channel. Actual money and hours of human resources that could have been devoted to making Fusion a better, smarter, clearer destination at its hour of best opportunity were squandered so we could attempt to be included with the cool kids on Snapchat. You can probably tell I'm still mad about this. I don't know if Fusion could have become an actual thing. There were problems up and down with its founding and management. I'm going to write a book about it one day. And fickleness about the mission. Were we supposed to do serious journalism with personal perspective, or we were supposed to chase celebrities of the moment to write things for the website so we looked cool? But I can tell you that the lack of focus on understanding what the audience we wanted to capture actually wanted for themselves left us at the whims of social media telling us the way. Find people where they are was the refrain, but we needed to find them and bring them home to something, which we never had enough time to do. I just want to share one more story, an especially tragic one for me and others, that it will feel familiar to lots of folks, but we shouldn't forget. And you probably knew these 3 words were coming: pivot to video. Good, I got a laugh, that was good. Now, I was under pressure a lot of places to bring more video into articles, because we love to monetize that pre-roll. But I was mostly spared the bigger pivot from text to video that other publishers underwent until I got to HuffPost in 2017. At that time, there were a lot of changes happening, including building a video team to do original video, meaning shows, that would be promoted through the Facebook Watch program and subsidized by Facebook to some extent. When I became executive editor later that year in 2017, video wasn't part of my world. But less than a year later, it would be a big part of my world when the head of our video team left to work at Facebook. I was happy to oversee a video team, and I learned a lot. But what we were doing wasn't working. It seemed like Facebook's strategy was constantly changing, and 13-minute, beautifully produced, documentary-style videos were not connecting with people. I would look at metrics. People spent X million minutes watching video this month. This one had 5 million views. But these numbers didn't really indicate if people were watching our work or if it was just sort of playing or auto-playing somewhere out in the ether. The best success we had was aligning slideshow-style text-to-screen pieces with our top text stories, so we could embed videos that were journalistically aligned and, get that pre-roll money. We worked toward 100% video insertion in our stories and came close, and we did turn on the autoplay. Those videos definitely added value to our work, but making that kind of visual product was not what many of the talented folks who were hired to make shows at HuffPost came to do. They were documentarians and cinematographers, and not only was text-to-screen not their thing, they weren't necessarily good at it. Quick-turn video storytelling is a different skill. And once that Facebook money dried up, because it did, and the algorithm changed, I was forced to lay off much of our video team. There was simply no way to find an audience to make a show strategy work at a text-based destination like HuffPost, a strategy that was incentivized strongly by companies and platforms that were not HuffPost itself. I really hated all of this, not least because I could see the folly from day one. There would be another chase, like Snapchat Discover, and resources and brainpower would be sucked away from the core business, in this case, HuffPost.com, to try and win the lottery with the same ticket everyone else had been given. The dissonance in managing these situations is soul-crushing. On-the-ground managers like myself can see what works. We're constantly looking at what readers are responding to, trying to do more of it, while also looking at what isn't working and giving directives to do less of that. It's always changing, and not just because of algorithms. Audiences change, people change. What they want to read or look at changes. We have to be constantly reacting to both the big stories happening in the world and also what we see in Parsley or Chartbeat or Amplitude, whatever your tool is, that provides actual data on what your actual audience is engaging with. We need to be mindful of the budget, be smart about smart about our editorial decisions, all the while maintaining steadiness and integrity as a brand. It's an exhausting balancing act, but it's what top editors have to do these days to remain successful and relevant. But even as we pay attention to the numbers and the analytics, we often have people above us who believe they know better, or who want a bite of a certain pie and issue orders to shift resources around to chase hot new things that folks living in the newsroom suspect won't work. But you do it anyway, or you did it because you had to, and you hoped for the best. That was how I felt at HuffPost. While I worked with the video team, we made really good things, and I hoped the runway would last as long as possible. But as I expected, it was too expensive, too slow to produce, and reliant entirely on distribution outside of our core product. But let me also say this very clearly. None of this is to impugn all the kind, supportive, and truly well-meaning folks at these platforms, some of whom may be sitting in this room, who genuinely wanted to support the news industry. I knew many journalists who left for Facebook and Twitter and Apple over the years to work on partnerships and collaborations in the service of journalism. I even had a job at CUNY that was underwritten by a grant from Meta. There is still money flowing from Google, although it seems only to go to the New York Times. And I had an LOL after that, but I didn't say it out loud. And Apple News Plus is growing its own subscription business and sharing revenue with its partners. But the shift now looks to be more in a direction of syndication, less of platforms dictating a certain kind of content or strategy, and more trying to capitalize on great work out there to better serve their own users. The only risk here is getting too hooked on whatever that rev share is they're offering today, because all of that could change tomorrow, and it will. And let me step back for a moment to clarify something else, going even farther back in time. The original sin in digital media wasn't committed by Facebook or Meta or Twitter or X or Snapchat. It was committed back in those early, heady days of the internet when everyone discounted the promise of the information superhighway and its eventual dominance of our nearly every waking moment and made news free. I was alive and an adult for most of this, and I can say with my own 2020 eyesight that hindsight is even clearer. I understand why this happened, because what the internet has become was practically unfathomable, and even our wildest dreams of the future didn't contain subplots about paying for online subscriptions. So I'm not really saying this to place blame, but to acknowledge something. We got in this mess with distributed content on social media, to a large degree, in my opinion, because we gave so much away for free on the promise of a digital ad market that not only didn't deliver what executives promised and hoped, but didn't ever seem to impress people the way print ads did or bring in the money. So the folks who could see this before others, who decided that it would be unsustainable to build a business model built solely around clicks and impressions and CPMs and eternal growth, are in a better position now, watching their once competitors and comrades like BuzzFeed News close up shop. The New York Times is obviously the monster example of this kind of diversification, but Slate is one too. Long before I was there, Slate was early and aggressive in offering membership, our term rather than subscription, via its Slate Plus program. The combination of Plus and an audience incredibly loyal to the brand, and yeah, there's a lot of overlap between those two, made becoming its editor-in-chief last year an irresistible opportunity. It was almost an inverse to the opportunity Fusion offered me 7 years before. Here was an online magazine that diversified its revenue streams early, both with Plus and with our audio division and podcasts. And by the way, it never pivoted to video. And Slate stayed focused on its core mission, to offer sharp, informed analysis on news, the courts, culture, and life, and advice on a daily basis to help readers make sense of the world around them. Sure, Slate's had other iterations, different leaders, different features, different voices over the years, but its core has stayed the same. And I should say also, I feel very strongly about this because Slate was the first place I ever published in 1999, when I wrote a column called Egghead for it about academic news. Yeah, it was really nerdy. But I've been a longtime fan and a loyal reader. And that kind of core and consistency is what's created the loyalty that has Slate Plus members renewing at a higher rate than ever and keeps folks returning to our work again and again. We actually had record signups for Plus in June since 2021. It was our best time in the last 2 years, June and July of this year. And the site itself is still a powerful driver of traffic and engagement. Indeed, together about half of our traffic comes from the homepage and internal referral sources, or people discovering more Slate once they are inside our environment. Beyond innovating on our homepage, we're constantly looking at smarter ways to recirculate and promote more of our work inside of our articles with an eye to relevance and personalization. And of course, we're still on social media, but we're investing in building engagement on stalwart platforms like Facebook and Instagram for our work, and looking for new strategic opportunities to find new audience on TikTok and other places rather than massive reach. I'm a Gen Xer. I'm a media person. I never got my news from a Facebook feed. Also, if you look for me on Facebook, I think I have 6 followers. I'm only on there because of my daughter using Facebook Messenger. I did for many years use Twitter as a tool for discovery, both for breaking news and interesting things to read and see around the internet. But Twitter, or X, is becoming an increasingly useless tool to use this way, especially as journalists abandon the platform, for one in the array of new offerings or just to give up altogether. My reading practice has returned to what it was in 2001. Tabs open on my browser each morning, where I scan headlines and pick what I want to read or need to read. I also pay for nearly everything I read, and have factored that financial commitment into my monthly bills. I've subscribed not to read one story, but to have access to a body of work. I understand through a site's identity, its homepage, and reading the work over and over. In fact, one site I subscribed to, The City, I liked so much I subscribed twice, but I got that fixed. It was an accident of enthusiasm. I have learned over time that I don't need access to everything, but the things I do need or want, I will pay for. I'm not sure you could launch a place like Slate now. On the site side, Slate's model is constructed around access to its text work via its homepage, and membership grows via loyal readers who want to support Slate as a whole, and those who ultimately hit a paywall and decide to commit. We also have a loyal audience for our podcast episodes, those who want to listen ad-free or who want the bonus content, but as you know, I'm focusing on the text today. We're always looking for ways to engage these most loyal folks, from offering exclusive segments and episodes for our podcast to doing Zoom events where members can directly interact with the newsroom, to even more advice content because we know the audience can't get enough. And of course, innovating on the homepage with new visual options for packaging, aggressively testing headlines, and offering opportunities for daily engagement with our new news quiz, which we just made daily. But going back to where I started this talk, all the things I just described about Slate don't make it bulletproof. But there is more within our control, as editors working with the business side to diversify our revenue and make Slate a success. And by that I mean a more stable, less susceptible to the vicissitudes and whimsy of the tech platforms that had a heavy hand in dictating our editorial strategies in the past. I think the decline in power of these platforms to give an inflated sense of potential loyal audience or potential size, and therefore advertising revenue, means fewer splashy launches of new sites and products that are doomed to fizzle after a year. But I also think it means more smaller, niche, local, nonprofit, passionate products. Just look at the launch this week of 404 Media, the new tech journalism project, that will allow each of us to build our own hand-built portfolio of things to read and listen to and consume. These new products will be curated by editors with vision. They'll be paid for by people who believe in them. And what we look at will also be curated by us, the readers, the listeners, the watchers, not an algorithm somewhere out there making decisions on our behalf. I don't know if it will be a simpler world, but I do think it will be a better one for journalism and the people who care about it. Thank you. Now we can take some questions if we have some, Anita.
Yes, you can. Hillary, thanks so much for that riveting talk. So much of what you said resonated with me in particular as somebody who used to work at Fusion. So I'll kick off the 15-minute question period and turn it over to audiences. So just as a reminder to everybody, you can submit your questions through the link in the session description on the conference website or app. So please do so now. But to kick things off, I'll start and ask you a question, Hillary. So you said that one of the learnings that you took away from your time at Fusion is that you can't build an audience on distributed platforms. And you mentioned at the end of your talk about local and niche news sites. So there's been a movement in our industry towards embracing community-based journalism, local journalism, where reporters are essentially going back to the basics in terms of consulting real people about the issues that matter to them and then reporting on those. So how do you feel about this movement at large, and are you applying any of those approaches to Slate, even though you guys are like a national news site?
Oh, it's interesting. I mean, talking about the going into communities and listening and responding, just small digression, but my first project at HuffPost was a bus tour across the country called Listen to America, where we took a literal bus across the country for 7 weeks and went to 25 cities and talked to almost 2,000 people in small and mid-sized cities and towns across America. And we really brought that back to dictate our editorial strategy. Like, that was what we did. That's why we created HuffPost Life, which is still a thriving part of HuffPost today. And so I really believe in that work of listening to the audience to inform what you do. How we do that at Slate is really through Plus. We have a big, robust, I mean, it's one way that we do it. We also just get feedback from unsolicited all the time, right? But we really survey our most loyal readers, and we're always trying to grow that base through newsletters and different kinds of engagement and opportunity. But we do survey them to find out, what is it, how are we doing? What do you want more of? What aren't we focused on? Where are you seeing that we have a gap or that we're sort of oversaturated? So that we are in a feedback loop and a conversation with those most loyal readers at Slate. And then we look to grow that group of readers and really be responsive to what they're thinking about. But that's very different than at a big scale place like HuffPost, where when we were really going through a strategy shift, we wanted to make sure we weren't in an echo chamber and that we did hear from people in parts of the country that we felt were underserved or that we weren't connected to. And then we actually, just indulge me for 1 second, the coolest thing was then I had a research team analyze all 1,700 interviews to pull out keywords so that we could see what the through lines were of the topics that came up most across the country. And we were able to look at those to help inform how we allocated our reporting resources and to see some commonality, even if it didn't matter if you were in Livingston, Montana or, Oxford, Mississippi. People were talking about the same things.
Great. So the questions are coming in fast and furious.
Oh, boy.
There's
I'm
great
scared.
one. Good ones, really good ones. So one from Jack at Illinois Public Media at the University of Illinois. Jack says, since the introduction of Google Analytics, it seems many of us have been chasing audience attention based on data. Do you think online analytics can truly be useful to news organizations?
Ooh, that's a big one. Okay. Let me say, I think, and I have a friend who won't be named, but I know would answer this question and say, no, they're not, and we should never look at them, and believes in this sort of purity of an editorial vision and this idea that we as the editors judge everything. We judge the newsworthiness, we judge the stories to tell, we decide what's important. And of course, me, along with my editorial team, we're doing that every day. But we absolutely want to publish pieces that resonate and that aren't like sinking like a stone. And that, I think it can be really disheartening, especially when you're working in pure news and you know these things need to be covered and they're important and you can't find audience for them. And I don't think you give up based on the analytics of one story. You give it 6 months. You see and you come up with a strategy, right? And again, my point isn't don't use social media. My point is think strategically about is there a Reddit subgroup, and Narda, who's on our audience team here, would be much smarter at talking about this than I am, but like, where can you seed the idea? Where can you go look for the audience to seed what you want them to see if you can get them to care about what you do, right? But you got to sort of look for them, not do a massive blast out to the world. But I think you just give yourself a time period, but you do need those analytics because resources are tight in all of our newsrooms, and depending on your business model, you don't have the luxury of assigning too many things that you can't find audience for.
Thank you. Anonymous asks, how do you square believing that news can't build audiences on external platforms with research showing younger and more diverse audiences are far less likely to consume homepages and other owned services?
Yeah, I think it's sort of to reiterate what I just said, but perhaps wasn't clear enough earlier. What I'm arguing against is strategy being built on the way a platform works, not ignoring the platform. So of course I still believe that, and again, we can move beyond Facebook, right? It's like Reddit or LinkedIn. There are all these social communities where you can look to find people who care about the same things you do, but you want the value to you, depending on your business model, but if you're an ad-based or nonprofit, I mean, everybody has different ways of looking at how they describe their audience. You do need to bring those people back to you and have them care about you. And that's a really important thing to be able to talk about is the people who come back and consume more than one thing or 2 things or 3 things, or they come back a couple times a week. We really look at that because we need to convert those people to being paid members. So that's where I think you should absolutely look for audience off platform, but then you need to figure out how you bring them to make them love you.
Okay. Julia at CBC Toronto asks, how do you recommend having the conversation with upper management that we should prioritize our efforts rather than always choosing the allure of new platforms and experimentation?
Okay, well, first, yoga helps. Deep breaths. I am a hothead. I've gotten a lot better, but I don't recommend being that way because it's much harder so being indignant is not always the best path, though I have tried it. But it's harder to be heard. I think, you know what I always say at Slate, we have a lot of meetings, right? Everybody has meetings. I hate meetings where you need something to react to in a meeting. So I always suggest somebody's got to bring an agenda or bring the plan. Like if you want to talk about, we're going to make this new job, somebody write the initial job description so you can bounce ideas off about it. So I would say not begin it as an open discussion, but bring your vision, bring an alternate plan, bring the thing that you think is going to be successful and use that as the way to talk about the problems with what somebody else might be proposing. I think it's a lot easier it's not easier, it's more effective to be proactive with ideas than just be reactive to things that you think are dumb or bad.
Solutions focused, I really like that. So Louise at Insider says, I'm a millennial and have worked at HuffPost and BuzzFeed and have been impacted by layoffs in places I dreamed of working and closed down. Do you have any advice for mid-career people on how to think of their career path in this new environment?
On how they're on career pathing in this environment?
Yeah, how to navigate this new space where platforms are not, everything.
Yeah, there are so many different ways to go. I mean, overall, when I try to give career advice, I think our guts tell us a lot, right? So even when I went to Fusion, it was a really cool opportunity, but I was like, is this gonna work? So when it wasn't sort of working, I had a little confirmation bias, I will say. So I think it really, if you're mid-career, you have to evaluate what matters most: stability, excitement, like how much risk you're willing to take on. Again, I think some of the risk is we have a smaller pool of places right now, so there's less risk in that the things are sort of contracting a bit. On the other hand, it gives me I'm hopeful that we're sort of past that crashing wave, and that where we are now, we're at least getting a little bit more stable and starting to look maybe even at ways to grow again across the industry. So I think personally, just in terms of how you decide what to do with your career, if you really want stability, look at a bigger place, look at the Times, the Post. I mean, it's not that nobody is ever immune. Things change, right? Like, that's what we're talking about. But I think it's really a risk evaluation at a point in your career. And I will say, I was unemployed for a year after HuffPost. I was lucky I could do that. I was 45, I think, and divorced, and I needed some time. A lot had happened, and it was a luxury. But boy, when I thought about going back into a newsroom, it was really scary because of exactly what this person is raising. And not only risk in terms of money, but having your heart broken over and over again, which is what a lot of us have gone through. And so I think you have to decide how much, if it's something hot and new and you know that maybe it's not going to work out, but you extract as much as you can out of it while you can. Or you think, maybe for a couple years, I just want to have a role at a place that I feel really confident isn't going to have too much turmoil.
So this is a question from Ben at Pittsburgh Tribune Review. Should news outlets abandon Twitter or X? It's a debate we've been having at our shop.
Ooh, should they ban it?
Abandon.
Oh, abandon it or ban it, whatever. I have to say, because I also can be very extreme on these, I have had these thoughts about Slate too. I'm like, should we just get off X? I don't know, maybe Narda has opinions about that. We are not doing that. People are attached to their identity still. I'm still on there. I mean, I only promote Slate things mostly, but I like to, and the reporters see it and other people see it. I think it's an individual choice for everyone. If collectively as a newsroom you were so deeply offended by Elon Musk, which I would understand, and you just decided in protest, but it's a personal, that's still kind of like a personal collective choice, because I'm not sure that sadly any of us leaving X is going to make a change in what it is or will become. So I think if people are still getting something out of being on the platform, and our journalists like promoting their work there, and we're still participating, we'll probably be with it until the end, the last day. I don't know, Katie, yeah, probably. But you see people trickling off. I don't know.
So Ken at WDIV TV asks, what strategies have worked for Slate to change audience habits?
Oh, it's a great question. I've only been at Slate for a year, so I don't have a ton of historical perspective, but I will say, we talked a little bit about advice. So Dear Prudence has been around for 20 years or so, and it was just a few years ago that the team, way before I got there, realized, wow, people love advice at Slate. It's a lot of people do advice, but Slate, Prudie is a brand. Prudie is a real, people know Prudie, they love Prudie. Prudie, who's now authored by our wonderful Janae Desmond Harris, who's just a really fantastic advice giver. So we expanded in the advice space, in parenting and money and also sex, knowing that it was a place where our audience really wanted more. So that's the thing in terms of audience habits. I would say we offered a lot more advice, and we saw the engagement grow with that offering. So I'll stop there because I haven't done a lot of other radical things that I can think of. Katie.
So Anonymous asks, what effective ways have you found to get writers and content teams more engaged in growing recirculation and deepening user journeys on site? I think that's kind of an elaboration of the last question in some ways.
Can you say it? Can you read it again?
What effective ways have you found to get writers and content teams more engaged in growing recirculation and deepening user journeys on sites?
So one thing when I got to Slate, I love events. Love this event. Love doing the bus tour at HuffPost and live events, and that's how I first met Katie, who's with me here, also from Slate today, back in the day. And so we started doing Zoom events for our Plus members, and the newsroom was like, who is going to show up to these Zoom events? Like, we're just reporters. And the first one we did was around advice. We had Advice Week in January. And I was like, these Slate Plus members are obsessed with you guys. They're going to come. And in fact, we've now done a series of these, and everyone has had more and more people. I think 350 people came to the jurisprudence one we did about the Supreme Court in June. That's a tiny fraction of the Plus membership, but getting 350 people in a Zoom to talk to your reporters and hear about their work is a pretty big deal, and it's really affirming for the reporters and the journalists themselves to see the engagement from our audience. So I think figuring out a way to connect the reporters more directly with our most loyal readers has been something that's been really motivating for them to care about their journey, the user's journey.
So it's 2 minutes to the end of the session, so I'm just going to ask you if there's anything else that you wanted to add or share with the audience as a takeaway.
So many things to share. No, just thank you for being here, and I hope this was resonant in some way, and thank you to everyone for the great questions and all the folks out there on the live stream for hanging in with us. It's really, I mean, having been in this business for this period of time and approaching 50 years of age, just having a forum to openly talk about some of this experience is a real privilege for me, and I appreciate it, so thank you so much.